Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on updating our item and our monster data models in our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code to this point, as well as complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. So now we finished updating our data models, and we added a new item type for our damaged ball. What we're going to do next is we're going to work on creating our Phaser game objects to represent our ball that we'll be using for catching monsters in our game. And so for this, we'll be creating a brand new class to contain all of the logic that's tied to this. And so this is going to be very similar to like what we do for our player and our enemy battle monster classes, where we'll create all of our Phaser game objects inside this class. It will have all of our logic tied to our animations, and we'll have our various methods for invoking those. And so to go ahead and get started with our changes, what we're going to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and go into our source folder. We're going to go under battle, and we're going to add a new file. And so what we'll do is we're just going to do ball.js. And so what we'll do is we'll just do export out our class, and we're going to do ball. And then the first thing we'll do is let's go ahead and add in our constructor. And so for our constructor, we're going to need some type of configuration object. And so for our configuration object, we're going to need a few different things. The first one's going to be our Phaser scene. And so this will be our scene that we're adding our game objects to in our game. The next is we're going to need the asset in our asset frame that's going to be used for rendering out our game object. So right now we only have our damaged ball, but we want the ability to have different ball types later in the future. And so by adding those as part of a configuration, then we can easily pass those in as we need them. And then finally, we're just going to add a few other properties that are going to align with like some of our other game objects. So like being able to skip battle animations. So if our setting for skipping animations is set to true, then we won't actually throw the ball or do the shake animation. We'll just have the monster disappear. Versus if it's set to false, then we would go ahead and play out our whole animation. And things like that. And so to go ahead and add in these properties, what we'll go ahead and do is we're going to add in a new type definition for our configuration. And so what we'll do is we'll just add in our comments. Let's do our type def, and we're just going to call this ball config. And so for our type, this is going to be an object. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is we'll do property, and we're going to have our Phaser scene for our first property. And so this will be the scene we're adding our game object to. And then I'm going to go ahead and just copy this and paste it a few times. And so this should be seen like this. All right, so our next one will go ahead and be our asset key. And so this will be a string. And so we'll do asset key. And then we'll have our asset frame. And so we'll do asset frame. And so we're going to make this optional. And we'll go ahead and set it equal to 0. And then so next we're going to go ahead and have skip battle animations. We'll also make a default for this, and we'll go ahead and do false. And finally, we're going to go ahead and do scale. And so this is going to allow us to scale our image game object depending on what properties passed here. And so if no settings provided, we'll do a scale of 1, so it'll be default value, and then we can go ahead and override that. And so for our asset frame, this is going to be a number. This will be a Boolean. And then finally, this will be a number for our scaling. So now what we can do down in our constructor, let's go ahead and add that in. And so for our config, this is going to be our ball config. All right, then what we'll do is let's just go ahead and add in a few private properties. So the first one we'll go ahead and do is scene. So this will be our Phaser scene. And then we'll have skip battle animations. And so for these, we can go ahead and add in our types. And so for our type, for our scene, this will be a Phaser scene. I'm going to go ahead and copy that line, we'll go ahead and paste it, and then we'll have our Boolean for our skip battle animations. So now what we can do in our constructor is we'll go ahead and assign those values. So we'll just do this. Our scene will be equal to our config scene. Then this skip battle animations will be equal to our config, and we'll go ahead and do skip battle animations. Now because skip battle animations is optional, we're just going to go ahead and add a check to see if it's undefined, and if it is, we'll provide our default value. And so we're just going to do config skip battle animations. If it is undefined, then we're just going to do config. We'll set our skip battle animations to go ahead and be false. All right, so the next thing we'll do is let's go ahead and create our Phaser game object. And so what we'll go ahead and do is we're just going to do this. We'll reference our scene. We'll do add, and we're going to go ahead and do an image game object. Now for our position, we're going to do 725 by 180, and we'll come back to these settings in a second. So now for our texture, we want to go ahead and do our config, and we're going to go ahead and provide our asset key. And then for our frame, we'll do config, and we'll go ahead and do asset frame. So then what we'll do is, because our asset frame can be optional, we'll go ahead and add in our default value. So we're just going to copy and paste this code here, and we'll go ahead and do our asset frame. If it's undefined, then we'll go ahead and set it equal to 0, so we have our default value. So then after that, we want to go ahead and scale our game object. And so what we'll do is we'll set scale, and now we'll go ahead and use our config, and we'll do our scale value here. Same thing, because it is optional, let's go ahead and add in our default value. And so we'll go do our config scale, and if it's not provided, so if it's undefined, we'll go ahead and set it equal to 1. So now that we have our base logic in place for at least creating our game object, now we need to go ahead and actually test to make sure everything's working. So what we're going to go ahead and do is let's jump over to our test scene, and this is where we'll go ahead and do our changes for this. So what we'll do is let's open up our preload scene. Let's come down to where we start our game scene, and we're going to switch from our title scene to our test scene so we can do our testing. All right, so what we're going to end up doing is previously we built this test scene here to allow us to test various changes outside of our battle scene, so that way we could easily and quickly prototype new features for our game. And so we're going to go ahead and use this scene here to go ahead and test out throwing our ball animation and building out our various monster animations to make sure everything's working before we start implementing it in our battle scene. And so this will save us a little bit of time. Since all that's logic abstracted away into a new class, we should be able to go ahead and use it in multiple locations with little issue. And so what we'll do in our test scene is the first thing we want to do is we're going to go ahead and close some of our panels here by default so we can easily see our phaser scene while we're building on our new feature. So what we'll do is we'll come to our add data GUI method. And so for our first folder here, we're going to go ahead and set this to false for being expanded. Likewise, for our attacks one, we're going to go ahead and hide that as well. And then that way our data GUI is minimized and we can see what we're actually doing. So now what we'll want to do in our scene is we want to go ahead and create an instance of our new class. So what we'll do first is let's come to the top of our class. Let's add a new property so then we'll have that available to us. So if we go ahead and add in our type, we want this to go ahead and be our ball. And so what we'll do is down in our create method, right after we do our slash attack, let's go ahead and create our instance. And so we'll have this ball will be equal to a new ball instance. And then for our configuration, we'll have our scene, it'll be this. For our asset key, this is going to be our battle asset keys, and we'll go ahead and use our damaged ball that we previously loaded. Our asset frame, we'll go ahead and just set that to 0. And for scaling, because this image is quite large, we're going to go ahead and do 0.1, so that's a little bit smaller. So now when our scene refreshes, we should see our new ball game object appearing on top of our monster in the location that we specified. So now we have our base game object in place. What we're going to do with our class is we're going to add in 2 methods for our 2 animations we'll be using in our game. So our first one is going to be a throwing ball animation. And so when we use our item, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to have our ball start down here in our corner, and we're going to throw it at our enemy monster to try to catch them. And so this is going to be a very simple animation where our ball is just going to animate across our scene with a tween. We'll go ahead and have it collide with our enemy sprite here in our scene. After that, we're going to go ahead and play a shake ball animation. And basically what this represents is we're going to have the ball shake a number of times. And this is going to be how close we are to actually catching the monster. And so as an example, if we catch our monster successfully, we could let our ball shake 3 times, and then we would say, hey, we caught the monster. If it was pretty close to being caught, but not quite, we could shake 3 times and then have the enemy break out. Versus on the other end, if we weren't close to catching the monster at all, like they're at full health, it was a very low catch rate, we could have it shake 1 time and then immediately break out. And so those are the 2 animations we'll be adding. And so we're going to work on that now. And so for our first animation, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to work on our throwing our ball animation. And so for throwing our ball, we don't want this to be in a straight line from one point to another. Instead, we're going to want to go ahead and use a curve to go ahead and create that. And so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want a type of curve where we start here and kind of like angle up until we get to our enemy monster. And so to go ahead and create this type of path we want our ball to follow, we can go ahead and create what's called a Bezier curve. And at a high level, this curve, basically what it is we define 4 points of where we want our item to travel along this curve. And how this works is basically we define our starting and end points, and that's going to be like this P0 and this P3 here. And this would be like a straight line. But by adding these two other points here, what it kind of does is it pulls on our path like this to the corner to go ahead and create this type of curve here. And by default, Phaser has this built in to the framework, and we can create these type of curves very easily. All we have to do is define our points of how we want our curve to look like, and then Phaser will go ahead and create a game object representing that path. And so this just creates a very nice curve for our game objects to go ahead and follow, instead of just being a straight path between these 2 points here. So to go ahead and do this, we're going to go ahead and create a new method to create our curve path here. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is let's make a new private method, and we're just going to call this create curve path. So in this method, the first thing we'll want to do is define our 4 points that are going to make up our curve. And so what we'll do is let's make a new variable, do const. We're going to go ahead and do our start point. And so to go ahead and create a point in Phaser, we can use the vector2 class, and this will allow us to provide our x and y value of where our point is. And so to do that, we can do new. We're going to do Phaser. We're going to go ahead and do math. We'll do vector2. Now we can provide our point. And so for our starting point, we're going to go ahead and do 0 for our x value, and we'll do 500 for our y value. And so our ball will start about down here in our scene. So then we'll need our endpoint, and so we'll go ahead and do a new variable. We'll do endpoint. I'm just going to copy this here, go ahead and paste it. And so for our end value, this is going to be our position that we provided for our initial game object here. And so for our endpoint, we'll go ahead and do our 725, and then we'll go ahead and do 180 for our y value, and then that way it ends right where our ball is right now. So now we'll need to define our 2 points that will go ahead and pull on our path to create our curve. And so for that, I'm just going to copy these 2 here. I'm going to go ahead and paste them in between these. And so I'm just going to do control point 1. I'm going to copy that, and we'll do control point 2. And so for these values, we're going to go ahead and do 200 and 100 for our y value. And then for control point 2, we're going to go ahead and do 725, and we'll do 180. And so we're just going to leave that the same as our endpoint, just so we get a little bit of a different type of curve instead of this full curve like this. And so now that we have our points, now we can actually go ahead and create our curve game object. And so we'll make a new variable. We're just going to call this curve. We're going to set equal to a new Phaser curves. And so from here, we're going to go ahead and do our cubic Phaser curve. And now we can provide our 4 points. So our 4 vector 2s. So we'll have our start point, control point 1, control point 2, and we'll have our end point. All right, so now we went ahead and created our curve game object. To actually use this in our game, we need to define what is called a Phaser path game object. And so basically our path game object allows us to take a curve and use that to create a path in our game. And so once we create that path, we can do things like use the Phaser internal graphics to go ahead and render out that path in our scene. But then we can also do some really cool things like have game objects follow that path automatically for us. And so this will make more sense once we actually see what we're building. And so we're going to go ahead and do that now. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is in our class, we need to go ahead and have a property to go ahead and store this path because we'll be using it throughout our class. And so what we'll do is make a new private property. We're just going to call this ball path. And so for our type here, we're going to copy, we'll paste. And so for our ball path, this is going to be a Phaser. It's going to be a curve. And then it's going to go ahead and be a path. So now what we can do is in our create curve path method, we'll just do this. We'll do our ball path is going to be equal to a new Phaser curves path. And we can go, need to use the new keyword. And then we can go ahead and provide our positioning where we want this to be positioned in our game. And so we're going to make this the same starting point as our curve. So then what we can do is we can use the add method to go ahead and add our existing curve to our path. And so now this is going to create a game object, but by default, your paths and your curves are not visible in our scene. And so to go ahead and actually render these out, we need to go ahead and create a graphics game object to draw these. And so to do that, we'll go ahead and make a new property. And we're going to store that in our class so we can also reference it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these 2 lines of code. Let's go ahead and paste it. And so we'll have our ball path graphics. And so for our graphics, this is going to be a game objects, and this is going to be a graphics type game object. So now what we can do is we can do this. We can go ahead and do our ball path graphics, and we can set that equal to this, our current scene. We'll use add, and we'll go ahead and add in graphics. So now that we have our graphics game object, we can go ahead and use that to draw to our scene. So the first thing we'll do is we're just going to go ahead and call the clear method to clear everything out. Then we're going to go ahead and set our line style. And so our line style is going to let us define the stroke, basically the color and the width of our lines we want to render out. So we're going to do 1, and we'll do 0x, 00, ff, 00. So then that way we have a green line appear. And for our alpha, we're going to go ahead and do 1. All right, so now we have our graphics game object defined. We can now pass that to our ball path to have it go ahead and render out to our scene. So to do that, we can reference our ball path game object, and we can use the draw method. And what that allows us to do is provide a graphics game object that we want to draw this path onto. And so we're going to do this. We'll pass in our ball path graphics, and then we'll go ahead and save. All right, so then once we do that, we just need to go ahead and call our new method, so that way we can actually create our path. All right, so once our game saves, we should now see in our scene a new green line appear in our game. All right, so just go ahead and recap what we did here is for our throwing ball animation, we want to go ahead and throw our ball between this point and this point, and we don't want to have a straight line. We want to go ahead and use a curve. And by default, Phaser has support for curves built into the framework. And one of the ways to do this is we can create what's called a cubic Bezier curve. And in order to do that, we need to provide our points that make up our curve that we want to draw to our scene. So this just creates our curve game objects, and by default, they're not rendered out and they're not renderable to the scene. Once we have this game object, we need to go ahead and create what's a graphics game object. And once we do that, we can use that to use the built-in canvas context to go ahead and draw out to our canvas. And once we have that game object type, we can use our draw method on our path to go ahead and render out what that path looks like. And so I'm just going to go ahead and bump this up to 4 just so it's a little bit bigger. And so we see now we have this really big green line here that we can see, and this is the path our ball is going to follow once we create our animation. All right, so now that we've created our curve of game object in our scene, what we need to do next is now we need to update our ball game object here to actually animate along this path and follow it so that we can create that smooth animation that we're looking for. So previously we saw how we could use a tween to animate an object between 2 points by modifying our X and Y positioning. But now what we want to do is we want our ball to go ahead and just follow this path here. And luckily, this is pretty easy to do with the Phaser framework. There are built-in game objects where we can have it follow a set path automatically for us. And so to do this, we can create what's called a path follower game object. And basically, the path follower game object is just a sprite game object that has additional methods and helpers to automatically have it follow this path game object that we've created. All right, so to go ahead and do this, the first thing we'll do is we're going to make a new property to go ahead and store our ball game object on. And so we'll come to the top of our class. Let's copy these 2 lines of code here. Let's go ahead and paste them. And so we're going to go ahead and name this property ball, and this is going to be our follower game object. And so for this, we'll use our Phaser, our game objects for our type, and we're going to do path follower. So now what we're going to do is when we create our image game object here, we're going to modify this logic. So instead of doing an image game object, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to use the method follower. And so this is going to allow us to create a follower game object. And so the first thing we need to provide is we need to go ahead and provide our path that we want our game object to follow along. And so for this is going to be our ball path. Besides that, the rest of our configuration settings can remain the same except for our X and Y value. And so for this, we want to go ahead and set this to the same X and Y value of where our first point is on our path. And the reason for that is once we position our game object to follow a path, the game object does not need to align with the path itself. What Phaser is going to do is it's going to determine where that game object is positioned at, and then it's going to animate it using the same path, but it's going to go ahead and calculate the difference. So as an example, if I had our ball positioned up here, and we had it follow this path here, it would go ahead and animate along the same type of path, using the same type of trajectory, but it would use a new calculated X and Y value. And so for our current game instance, we want to actually follow the same path here. And so to make sure that happens, we just need to make sure our starting X and Y value matches that first point on our path. So besides that, we'll go ahead and keep our same asset key in our asset frame, and we'll also call our set scale. So then what we're going to do is we just need to move this above where we create our follower. So then that way it's available when we go ahead and create our game object here. All right, so when our scene refreshes, we'll see our ball is the beginning of our line. And so now we just need to go ahead and have our ball animate along our path. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and just use the built-in method that's available to us because we created this follower game object. So for testing, for the time being, we're just going to do this logic inside our constructor, and then we'll go ahead and move this to our animation method we'll create later. And so what we'll do is we're going to reference our ball game object, and then we're going to call the start follow method. And now this allows us to provide a configuration for our animation that we're about to create. And so for our start following configuration, we can provide things that are very similar to like our tween configuration. So like we can do a delay if we want to wait so many milliseconds before this starts. We can do our duration, which will be how long it's going to take the game object to follow this path and reach the end. And then we can also do things like our easing of what we want this to use for how it's going to move along the path. And so for this, we're just going to do phaser, we're going to do our math, we'll do easing, we'll go ahead and do sine, and we'll do in out. And then lastly, what we can do is we can get a callback for when we finish reaching the end of our path. And so what we're just going to do is we'll do on complete. And so for the time being, I'm just going to do a function, and we're just going to do console.log, and we're just going to do done. So if we want to go ahead and test, let's go ahead and save and refresh our scene. Oh, and actually what we need to do is we need to store a reference to our ball, to our game object that was created. So now if we want to go ahead and save and test, we'll see right away when our scene refreshes, our ball is going to start at the beginning and is going to animate and follow along our path here. All right, so just to quickly recap what we did here is we used our curve game object that we created and we stored that in our property. And after we created that curve, what we went ahead and did is we created a brand new game object type, and that's this path follower game object type. And this is basically just a phaser sprite, but it has some additional methods to allow it to interact with paths and do things like follow the path automatically. And internally, phaser is going to go ahead and take that path and calculate our position of where our sprite game object needs to go based on that path as it's moving along it. And so that's going to allow us to create things like this nice trajectory here and have it follow it. And basically to do that, we just use our start follow method, and that's where we provide our configuration. All right, so just a few things to keep in mind is with your path follower game object, your starting X and Y position you provide does not need to match your path here. If it does match, then you'll see your game object will animate along that path without any issues. But what we can do is we can provide a different starting X and Y position. And what phaser will do internally is it's going to go ahead and use that initial position to figure out where our game object should land and the path it should animate along, so then that way it animates along the exact same type of trajectory of that path we created here. And so we can see just by modifying our Y value, our game object does the same type of curve, but now it's above the current path that we provided. And so if you want to use the same path, you need to make sure you just use that same starting position when you define your curve down here. And so another thing to keep in mind is when you create your curves and your paths, you don't actually need to draw those out to your scene, and we don't need to create a graphics game object. This is just useful if we want to go ahead and debug and see the path that we're creating. So as an example, if I just comment out this code here, and basically what we're doing is we're just creating our points, our curve, and our path, then we're creating our path follower game object to use that curve, we'll see that our scene still works and our ball now follows that path without any issues. All right, so now we've taken a look at how we can create our path and our curve game objects and how we can use those to have another game object follow that path that we define. That actually brings an end to this video. In our next video, we're going to continue working on our ball class, and we're going to go ahead and start adding in our methods for our different types of animations. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.